Hi, my name is Marcel Gergis, and I'm going to be speaking to you today about the artistic chess maneuver entitled the Windmill. It is my hope that as a viewer, you are already familiar with the rules of chess, such as how the pieces move, what the endgame conditions are, and how check and checkmate work. The windmill is named after the repetitive rotary maneuver in a literal windmill. Essentially, a windmill in chess is when one player is forced to move his king back and forth in a sequence because he's forced out of being in check while you take each of his pieces in a row, just like dominoes. I will show you 3 examples of a windmill being executed. One that hopefully will illustrate why it's called the windmill, and 2 that are games by grandmasters showcasing what a windmill looks like in a real game setting. The first example of the windmill, it takes place on the board that you see before you. A windmill typically is the result of a rook and bishop, or a rook and knight, working together to cause the king to maneuver between the same 2 squares. In this scenario, you can see an exposed king on the back rank and a rook able to check the king. So if this rook were to move in front of the king has but one location available to him. That location would be this square. However, that square is also assaulted by this bishop, which means that once the rook in this location moves out of the way, regardless of where he moves, the king will again be in check and will have to go back right to where he was, and the process can become repeated. So, to show you what this actually looks like, I'm going to play the move, check. From here, the king has but one location that he can go to. This one. Now, I can move the rook in any direction, and because of the revealed check from this bishop, the king is going to have to move, and that will enable us to again put the rook in the location to check the king. In this scenario, we will move the rook to capture the pawn, putting the king in check. The king now must move, and we put the rook right back to where it was. The king goes back to the attack square, and we are able to, once more, capture another piece, the knight, putting the king, once again, in check. The king moves, and, as you guessed it, is checked. And then finally, we are able to take the last piece, checking him again. In this illustration, you saw one example of the windmill being executed. As you can see, the windmill does not immediately end the game in chess. Instead, the windmill allows you to gain a large material advantage over your opponent. The next 2 illustrations of the windmill are 2 games by grandmaster players. The first of which takes place in 1925 between Sir Carlos Torrepeto and Emmanuel Lasker. In this illustration, the first move is an odd-looking one where this is the first move, where the bishop is moved and the queen sacrificed. But the compensation for the queen sacrifice is the ability to execute the windmill. Watch as the king is placed in check, and the familiar pattern of the bishop attacking where the king is supposed to go comes into play, enabling the rook to move along the adjacent file and capture each of the pieces in a row. This is just like the rotary mechanic of a literal windmill, and the result is finally being able to capture back the queen. I've now shown you 2 examples of the windmill. The most extraordinary example that I wish to show you is a game played by the famous Bobby Fischer, entitled The Game of the Century. In this last example, instead of using a bishop and a rook to execute the windmill, a knight and a rook is utilized. So, the game between Bobby Fischer and and Donald Byrne is seen right here. It is Bobby Fischer's turn to play, who is the dark player. He begins by checking the white king, whom has but one location that he can go to. Next, Bobby Fischer sacrifices his queen and begins the windmill. He puts the king once more into check. The king is now forced into a corner. The knight delivers the next check. The king goes right back to the same spot so that he can become checked once more. The knight captures a piece. The king goes back to the same spot. The knight checks him once more. The king repeats the dance. The knight is able to now capture the rook. You have now seen 3 examples of the windmill. It is my hope that you will be able to, in your own games, perhaps execute this tactical maneuver in chess. If not, then at least be able to recognize when one of your opponents aspires to use it against you. Thank you for your time,